Well, hello to everyone out there, whether you are in Europe, in the United States, or somewhere else in the world. We're glad that you've taken the time to join us for this webinar. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American-German Institute, and I'm going to hand things over in a moment to my colleague, Peter Rashish, who is the vice president of AGI and the director of our geoeconomics program. But before I do that, I just want to say how pleased we are to be able to offer this discussion and the presentation of the results of research under the title of Smoot-Hawley, the Havana Charter, or the McKinley Tariff, about historical analogy and U.S. trade policy. And we are, as always, in these events, very proud to be in collaboration with the German Academic Exchange Service, which goes by the initials DAAD, which supports our DAAD AGI Visiting Fellowship Program. So with that, let me hand things over to Peter Rashish, who is going to take us through the session. Peter?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and welcome to everybody, and thanks to our viewers for joining. We are on the way out from one administration, which to a certain degree and in certain ways has used historical analogies in framing its trade policy. We are on the way to another one next month, where we've seen the incoming president also use history as a way of describing or justifying his approach. So I think this is an extremely timely event that we're doing today, one where we will explore how references to the past are used to inform, legitimate, and contest U.S. trade policy decisions. We have two panelists today. First, to discuss the 1945 to 2021 period, Edward Knudsen will look at how policymakers have traditionally understood the legacy of interwar protectionism in the United States, especially the infamous 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff, and how and why we remember certain events and not others, as well as what effect this has had on policymaking. And then to examine the relationship between political change and memories of economic history, Elizabeth Baltzan, counselor to U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, will discuss how the legacy of the post-war Havana Charter and the proposed International Trade Organization informed the administration's idea of a worker-centered trade policy. And then to conclude, they will both discuss historical precedents for Donald Trump's proposed trade policies and ask whether and how such analogies are useful. Before we get started, let me briefly introduce them. Ted Knudsen is a doctoral researcher in international relations at the University of Oxford. We are pleased that he is a DAAD fellow in geoeconomics here at AGI, and he's also an affiliate policy fellow at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. His research focuses on the political economy and economic history of the United States and Europe in the 20th century, specifically international sanctions, organized labor, and the role of memory in international economic policy. Previously, he worked for the U.S. and the Americas program at Chatham House in London, the Center for International Security in Berlin, and advised the S&D group in the European Parliament. Ted holds a master's in international political economy from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a bachelor's degree with majors in history and economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Beth Baltzan serves as counselor for trade and investment at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. She previously served as an attorney at USTR from 2003 to 2009. After that, she joined the Office of International Affairs at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, working on oversight in the wake of the financial crisis. In 2012, she was detailed to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, where she investigated banking practices. And later, she served as Democratic Trade Counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee from 2012 to 2016. She later formed her own trade consultancy practice, and Beth has also served as a fellow at the Open Markets Institute. She received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center and her BA in International Relations from Stanford University. We'll start out hearing from Ted and then from Beth, then I will launch into a brief conversation with them, and then, of course, we'll be pleased to open up the webinar to your questions. And if you have a question, just use the Q&A button, and I'll make sure to get it to them. So let's start with you, Ted. Over to you.
Great. Can you see my slides now? Good. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Peter, for the kind introduction, and thanks, of course, to the AGI for supporting this research, and thanks to Beth for joining. I'm talking about the role of memory in trade policy, and Beth has been a kind of a foot soldier in the memory battles, or maybe more accurately, a general in the memory battles over trade that I'll outline, so I really appreciate that. But I want to start here. You might be wondering what's with the background here, and I think that'll become clear because I'll start with a quote from former and soon to be again President Trump, who said on the campaign trail, quote, "In the 1890s, our country was probably the wealthiest it ever was because it was a system of tariffs. We had a president, you know McKinley, remember Mount McKinley?" And that's, of course, formerly named Mount McKinley in the background, now Denali. Of course, Trump, has an axe to grind with the renaming there. But he goes on he repeats this analogy a different time. He says, "Call it what you want. Some might say it's economic nationalism. This is the policy that built this country, and this is the policy that will save our country. In the words of a great but highly underrated president, William McKinley, quote, 'The protective tariff of the Republicans has made the lives of our countrymen sweeter and brighter.'" It's not just Trump. His incoming Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, said at Madison Square Garden, he said, "When was America great?" He asked the audience, and then he answers his own question. "The turn of the century. Our economy was rocking. We had no income tax, and all we had was tariffs, and we had so much money." I think this got drowned out a bit by some more outlandish comments that were said at that same rally, but this is a pretty remarkable statement, I find. And as someone that studies memory and economic policy, I find this really interesting that as the Make America Great slogan has stayed the same, but in 2016, it's kind of an implicit callback to the 1950s. Sometimes that's made even explicit, the sort of golden age of American capitalism, the industrial workers. But 8 years later, we've actually moved back in time in terms of the period of greatness that Trump is supposedly calling back to. And in that vein, I want to of course, there's a lot of things to debunk about this. America was not richer in 1890 than it is today. That's pretty obvious. And there's a slew of articles to that effect. And we can get into some of the history a bit later. But what I want to talk about is actually these struggles over memory and looking at what role analogy and memory plays. Like I said, there's plenty of debunking out there. And so I actually want to look kind of deeper at memory specifically. So just to structure this a little bit, I'm going to begin with kind of situating the research project just briefly, and then jumping into really what was the dominant historical reference point in U.S. trade policy for decades, which is, of course, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. In particular, you see its very effective invocation after the 2008 global financial crisis. And then look a bit more theoretically at the creation of collective economic memories and how those can become hegemonic over time. And then looking more specifically at how Smoot-Hawley got here as the kind of dominant myth that was invoked in 2008, and then finally looking at efforts to sort of dethrone Smoot-Hawley as this dominant historical reference point by both the Biden administration and Trump administrations. And then, of course, open up to Beth's actual kind of on-the-ground practitioner point of view, and then, of course, Q&A. Just to situate this briefly, there's a lot in economics. They talk about the past, but I do so in a little bit different way. A lot of the approaches, the existing approaches, they use the concept of maybe learning or talk about narratives and how those shape policymakers, or this great book from Barry Eichengreen talks about uses and misuses of the past. But I do this a little differently, looking at actually how memories and how references to the past have evolved over time, because at a given point when policymakers are invoking the past, they don't really have a free range of analogies to choose from that might resonate. There's been a political process that takes place over decades to really kind of insert these in the public consciousness. And so I want to do that in addition to what some of these other works have done. And the Eichengreen book is actually a good place, a good jumping off point, because he talks specifically about how policymakers invoked Smoot-Hawley after 2008. And he admits that the effects of Smoot-Hawley have been exaggerated in terms of how much it contributed to the Depression or if it contributed to World War II. He's very straightforward about this, says it wasn't as big as it's made out to be, but he calls it bad history in support of good policy. And I want to kind of interrogate that idea a little bit and ask, how much do we want to have bad history in favor of good policy, especially when a lot of the same free trade advocates are bashing Trump for his shaky references to McKinley. As I said, I want to dwell more on the memory than the history itself. And what I find really interesting here is after 2008, an American tariff from 1930 is popular decades later, after no one in power is remembering this at the time. This is not a personal memory. This is a collective or societal memory. And so you have WTO Secretary General Pascal Lamy. He says it was surely one of the factors contributing to the geopolitical instability that in turn led to the Second World War. The G20 employs references to this repeatedly, and Lamy himself references it about 20 times over the same time period. And so you really see by this point, it has become dominant and really internationalized. And so I find a kind of remarkable fact, and I want to know how we got here. Of course, the tariff itself, just briefly, Hoover had run on a protectionist platform in 28. The House passes this bill in 1929, sort of right after the stock market crash. It wasn't signed into law until after the start of the Great Depression. And even very pro-free trade academics like Doug Irwin says that Smoot-Hawley appears to have been a very small direct shock to trade, and therefore it's likely to the economy at large. There's some accuracy to the idea that it caused retaliatory tariffs. It certainly didn't contribute to overall global harmony, but some of the more strong causal claims that it contributed to war, I think we can, if not discredit, at least cast some degree of doubt on, because a lot of the backlash was with US allies like Canada. And then, of course, well before World War II, you have the RTAA, the Reciprocal Tariff Agreement Act, passed, which then allows for reciprocal tariff reductions. And so that's seen as kind of a turning point in US trade policy. But however, today it's considered this disaster and a symbol for the follies of protectionism. The State Department website even says, they sort of talk about the symbolic nature of this. They said it's become a byword for protectionism and a symbol of the follies. And so I find it interesting that even the State Department sort of acknowledges that it's a symbolic term more so than it is necessarily the devastating economic event that it's made out to be. And a New York Times article from the time that I find very funny, over 1,000 economists asked Hoover to veto this. Of course, he does not veto it. So something to think about with letters of lots of economists writing to presidents to veto tariffs, something to maybe think about over the next 4 years and how effective that is. But to frame this, in actual terms, of course, you see a huge spike in the tariff rate for dutiable imports, but a lot of imports were actually not subject to duties at the time. So the tariff rate on overall imports doesn't spike that much as you see in 1930. And more importantly, I think by the 2000s and 2010s, tariff rates are very, very low in the US. You could see a similar graph worldwide. So the idea that we're on the verge of going back to Smoot-Hawley in 2008, I think just sort of visually, you can see that is maybe not quite accurate or not a well-founded fear. And so what I want to use, I'll be brief on the theory here so we can talk more about the empirics. But I use this theory of historical memory and merging it with Gramsci's theory of hegemony. And so if historical memory is the ways in which collectives and nations construct and identify with particular narratives about historical events, so that's a historical memory, and then that can be sort of hegemonized, if you will, where it becomes this like constant reference point. Think maybe in foreign policy, it's always 1938 lessons of Munich, right? This is like this very hegemonic historical reference or historical memory that's invoked. And essentially, in more layman's terms, what you can see here is it's basically the process of creating a historical common sense. And a quote I quite like about this is that hegemony is like a pillow. It absorbs blows, and sooner or later, the would-be assailant will find it comfortable to rest upon. And you see this in my other branch of research, which is about the Weimar hyperinflation in Germany and the legacy of that. And so a quote here from Christine Lagarde from just last year, saying that developments in Germany after the First World War make it clear how price stability and democracy are linked. She's doing this event with Lindner and sort of espouses this very German reading of the past as a French woman. And so this is, I think you could see a sort of resting her head on the pillow of hegemony. And I want to look at an analogous event and process in trade policy. Again, just briefly, what I break down collective memories into this kind of typology, of different emotional salience. You can have just an analogy, which is just sort of more analytical, doesn't arouse a lot of emotional intensity. This can get elevated to things like a tradition or an identity, where you say, to be American is to be a free trader, right? And then it has this much greater emotional significance. It's a bit harder to argue with. Traumas and syndromes are interesting. Again, from the foreign policy realm, I think it's. And lessons as well. So, like, for example, it's the lessons of Munich, but it's the Vietnam syndrome, right? We want to get over Vietnam we don't want to learn that as a lesson. We want to get over the syndrome of that, but we want to learn the lessons of Munich. It has a sort of implicit kind of hawkish reading by the terminology that's become dominant. And in terms of when policymakers can actually argue over history, I argue that there's two main ways you can do this. You can really, it's what I call the contest of memory, which is when you argue that the other side doesn't really have an accurate reading of the past. To use this Munich analogy again, that's if you were to say, no, actually, the Munich Agreement made sense because in 1938, Britain wouldn't have been equipped to go to war. It was actually good that they did this. You're kind of contesting this dominant reading that it was selling out the checks. Or you could have the contest of analogy, which is to say, no, the situation we're in is nothing like 1938. Putin is not Hitler, et cetera. You're disputing the analogy. And so as we go through this, I think it's important to disaggregate the ways that people argue about history and memory. And of course, you have also, as you start off with a personal memory of these events, and that eventually fades to collective memory, and in that process becomes more politicized and usually a less accurate representation of the past. One question that comes up a lot in my research is, why do policymakers cite economic history? And there's sort of three main explanations here. One is that they just really believe that history repeats itself. The other is a sort of heuristic. They know it's not an exact parallel, but if there's a time of uncertainty, it sort of helps to clarify it, right? You could see that after 2008 with protectionism. People don't know what's going on, but they know that the last time we had a big depression, there was a lot of protectionism. Or you could see just a cynical usage. They've already made up their minds about what policy they want, and they reach into the history books to justify what they already want to do. What I found is that it's really a mix of these, which might be a bit unsatisfying, but I've talked to some former USTR, I guess you could say sort of the old guard, if you will, and they say, the atoning for Smoot-Hawley is at the core of everything we do. I've heard that. I've heard from other senior figures in multilateral institutions that, oh yeah, I invoked Smoot-Hawley to ward off tariffs. I knew it wasn't good history. The historians are mad at me for it, but I got what I wanted. So you can see there's both a deeply felt and a kind of cynical usage that's possible. So what I look at empirically here, and thanks so much to Lucas, the intern here, has helped me with some of the archival work in the Senate records, so shout out to him. And here's just a very, very quick breakdown of how Smoot-Hawley is invoked. You can see on the right the actual numbers in terms of the times it was invoked. It's very interesting that this spikes in the 1980s, right? A full half century after the event itself, and really as it's fading from personal memory, fully fading into the collective memory. And there's a lot of struggles over trade policy under Reagan. And so, this is sort of good evidence for what I'm saying, is that the way we talk about the past is not this natural outgrowth of history. It's this political process that's constructed. And you see this evolution of how Smoot-Hawley is used. In the 40s and 50s, it's criticized as much on procedural grounds as it is on substantive ones. A lot of senators are saying, there was so much log rolling or back scratching. It's seen as a kind of corrupt process. And they like the RTAA because it takes this congressional log rolling process out of it. And they'll argue, okay, we should have 25% lower tariffs than Smoot-Hawley or 50%, but it hasn't become this sort of general symbol for the follies of protectionism in general, and it's not used quite as much as a scare tactic. What you have later in the 50s and 60s is this argument that protectionism causes war really starts proliferating, and a lot of, but there's still a sort of a backlash to what they see as the overuse of Smoot-Hawley references. You have really exasperated senators saying, can we just talk about the trade policy at hand? Like, do we really have to bring up Smoot-Hawley every time we're debating the specific issue? But they're increasingly fighting a rearguard action. I think a lot of this has to do with, as Cordell Hull is increasingly mythologized, he gets the Nobel Prize in 1945, publishes his memoirs in 48, and dies in 55. And so throughout this process, he's becoming sort of more like a godlike figure for free traders. His memoirs are published really widely. They're excerpted in almost every newspaper around the country. So he's really this like both a policy and a memory entrepreneur, I would call it. He's in the interwar period, kind of lonely, arguing for free trade. Eventually gets a lot of influence as Secretary of State under Roosevelt. And posthumously, really, his narrative, his reading of both policy and history becomes very important. By the 70s and especially 80s, you get these increasingly shaky historical retellings. I'll just quote a couple briefly here because I find some of these remarkable. And these are basically exaggerations of Cordell Hull's belief that economic tensions leads to war. And so from 1979, you have one senator saying, Hitler's way to power was paved by Hoover's Smoot-Hawley Tariff. You have another saying that barriers in trade helped produce Hitler. In 1985, this is probably the most outlandish one, he said, Auschwitz and Hiroshima were ultimately consequences of Smoot-Hawley. So I would say, as much as we can probably debate the finer points of the effects of Smoot-Hawley, it's probably fair to say that some of those are exaggerations. And later, especially in the 90s and 2000s, what you have is rather than Smoot-Hawley being used as kind of a scare word to ward off any additional protectionism or say the removal of MFN status for say China, where it's actually, it would be a tariff increase. And maybe they're exaggerating by saying that would be a replay of Smoot-Hawley, but at least it's there to kind of ward off what would be a move in the protectionist direction. You then have a reversal of this, which is invoking Smoot-Hawley to advance more liberalization. So saying if we don't sign NAFTA, that's just like Smoot-Hawley. And so it sort of goes in the reverse direction and becomes more of an offensive than a defensive rhetorical tool. Next slide. Eventually, you do have many presidents invoke this, but it's more of a partisan tool until Reagan. They know that the Republicans were in favor of Smoot-Hawley, so they use it the Democrats use this to bash Republicans. Kennedy mentions it, LBJ mentions it. Nixon and Eisenhower eventually do, but as far as I found, not while they're presidents, only in their memoirs published later after the Smoot-Hawley narrative gets popularized. And so, you have Reagan here invoking, saying that we learned the lessons of protectionism half a century ago, and we tried to balance the trade deficit by erecting a tariff wall. The Smoot-Hawley tariff ignited an international trade war and helped sink our country into the Great Depression. Of course, the same year, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this famous classroom scene where he mentions Smoot. You can barely see it in the corner. He calls it Hawley Smoot, but you can see the OOT. And so this is also the start of the Uruguay round. And so there's this kind of, I see mobilization of Smoot-Hawley, to pursue greater liberalization. And what Reagan also does, what I think is important here is you have this increased usage of Smoot-Hawley just as trade becomes no longer an unambiguous benefit for the United States, because the US slips into a trade deficit. In the 50s and 60s, you have a lot of senators saying, yeah, let's invoke Smoot-Hawley. They even kind of admit it. They're like, we benefit from trade. Europe's devastated. Like, we are exporting. Trade is a big win for us. And so it's seen as like a kind of win-win. From the 80s onwards, it's not so clear. You have industrialization, deindustrialization pick up, and the trade deficit expands. And so what I argue is there's this increasing need to kind of defend free trade from the material harms that come along with it. Obviously, there are gains from trade. I know all that theory. I don't want anyone to get mad at me, but it's not unambiguous really for everyone anymore. And at that time, what I also find interesting is this use of a siren song metaphor. And Reagan, another quote from 2 years ago, he says that the American people stayed true to our heritage by rejecting the siren song of protectionism. So he's both calling it a temptation to give into it, and he's saying that it's really part of American identity, right? If you don't support free trade, you're not a real American. And every president until Obama also uses the same metaphor, I think because they know that there's some communities that maybe don't benefit from trade, or at least don't feel they benefit from trade. And so there's this increasing need to say, don't give in to temptation. Trump, of course, is the president of giving in to temptation, you could say, kind of lashing out and rejecting this Obama idea that, we have a choice from retreating into these old economies or pressing forward. He says, no, like, I'm gonna be on your side. I'm gonna get you a fair deal. We're not gonna surrender. And again, you have some historical debunking from people like Doug Irwin. But what I find interesting in this first term of Trump is his trade policy is a little scattershot. It's obviously tends protectionist, but he thinks about getting rid of NAFTA entirely. He then renegotiates it because there is this mobilization, and there's a big mobilization specifically around Smoot-Hawley. Again, I remember just Googling it when he did his steel and aluminum tariffs, and it's hundreds and hundreds of results. Every news outlet is saying, do you know about this little tariff called Smoot-Hawley? And in a lot of ways, I think that might have been the last gasp of the effectiveness of the Smoot-Hawley narrative, because people eventually tire of it a bit. Trump, for his part, tries to find historical precedents. They argue, is it Jackson? Is it Hamilton? Doesn't bring up McKinley that much. I think Hamilton doesn't sit very nicely with his narrative probably because of the musical, and they were sort of liberal coded. So there's maybe a few different reasons for that. But there's no clear historical precedent or vision. They're trying to change policy, but they don't really have they don't really know their ground in these memory battles. And so I think that does maybe limit them a bit, because it's not clear exactly where they're going. Of course, the next administration, and I'll let Beth talk on this a lot more, but because this is something that they've been trying to popularize, and this is Catherine Tai talking about really what they see as the true legacy of the New Deal, which is the ITO, which ultimately wasn't enacted by the U.S. Congress, but she cites the enforceable and meaningful worker standards based on the goal of full employment for all members, environmental equities, and also anti-monopoly provisions. And there's this idea that, rather than the race to the bottom, we're going to do a race to the top. And so in trying to create a sort of a multilateral argument that also allows for domestic, say, greater workers' rights, et cetera, there's this need to reach back into history and find a precedent. And more, we can talk about this more with Trump and the sort of different uses of trade restriction. I think we can get into this when we talk more about the specifics of the McKinley analogy. But this is Doug Irwin's dichotomy of the different reasons for having tariffs, revenue restriction or reciprocity. And what I have just been thinking about is maybe we should disaggregate restriction, right? You can use that to defend incumbents. You can use it to protect innovators and infant industries, or to protect industrial workers. And so even though there might be a degree of restriction in two different administrations, that could have different goals for actually what the purpose of the restriction is. And what I find really interesting about Trump is he's actually calling back to this revenue thing, and that's more in the that's more in the 1800s, where there was no income tax, as Lutnick talks about, and tariffs could be used for that. So just to conclude, this is a magazine from the 1890s calling McKinley the Napoleon of tariffs, just a funny image. And so my concluding thoughts here that I think are most relevant for this audience is that there's these different ways of contesting memory. That's either the contest of analogy or contest of memory, and I think you can see that in these Senate debates that I talk about. I'll have a piece published about this that will have more specific quotes of that. But most importantly, this process of hegemonizing one history is really slow. I mean, Cordell Hull is really at work on this for a long time, and eventually kind of wins out. And so I think that's important, because with the current USTR and Biden administration, I think a lot of people in Washington hadn't heard of the ITO until really Beth starts talking about it, and she can share that more. But of course it is a struggle. Like you have, in the same way that Hull has a hard time asserting himself even within his own administration, you have people like Henry Wallace talking about the benefits of economic nationalism. I think there's something analogous going on today, where you have Jake Sullivan using this sort of this rote line about we need to not go back to the perils of interwar protectionism. He said this at Brookings just a few weeks ago. And so you have different parts of the administration kind of talking different types of history, and that makes it hard to hegemonize something in the broader culture. But it is a long struggle, and we really don't know where that's going, and if the ITO will become sort of central, or if McKinley is really going to take over. But either way, I think we can be sure that however U.S. trade policy is debated, it's not going to just be this technocratic negotiations. It's not just going to be about tariffs. It's also going to be battles about memory, as we've seen in some of the history that I've been talking about. So with that, I think we can hand it over to Beth and talk about what it's actually like to fight in these memory battles, as I call them.
Thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate that. I think what I'd like to do for my part of the presentation before we get to Q&A is give some insight into how I've looked at history and how that history then informs how we can tackle some of these issues today. I'm going to go back even further than the 19th century to start. I'm going to go back to Adam Smith, because Adam Smith was supposedly the father of free trade. We remember him for the invisible hand, a term I think he only used once, as though he were some kind of libertarian who thought market forces were the be-all and end-all. But that's a gross misrepresentation of his views. First and foremost, he was an anti-monopolist, and he worried about the political influence of monopolists in 18th century England. He saw tariffs as a vehicle through which monopolists extracted rents from workers. His views on monopolists are scathing. Once we understand the connection among Adam Smith, tariffs, and monopolies, we can actually make much more sense of the politics of tariffs during the Gilded Age and after. Who sought tariffs during the Gilded Age? Robber barons like Andrew Carnegie. It was the era of trusts. That's why tariffs were once described as the mother of all trusts. To be clear, Carnegie's rents didn't trickle down to his workers. The Homestead steel strike is one of the most famous in American history. Homestead was a Carnegie steel mill. And it's not just Carnegie. We can look at the hideous fate of workers burned alive in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the repugnant conditions in meatpacking that led Upton Sinclair to write The Jungle. That was the Gilded Age in America. As the labor movement grew stronger, employer associations themselves got organized to counter it. Among those hostile to labor during the Gilded Age was, for example, the National Association of Manufacturers. And so anti-monopolists like Woodrow Wilson opposed tariffs because he, as Adam Smith before him, saw that tariffs that line the pockets of robber barons are harmful to working people. Ted, you've talked about Smoot-Hawley. In those days, Congress set tariffs through tariff bills. You've done a great job of correcting the record. And Paul Krugman recently did a Blue Sky thread, once again digging through and debunking the argument that Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression. But let's touch on what did cause the Depression. Well, financial speculators crashed the economy in 1929. Even then, the result could have been a painful but limited contraction. Once again, straight-shooting economists help us understand what happened. It wasn't Smoot-Hawley that turned a contraction into a depression. It was bankers. Bankers who were fixated on the gold standard, bankers who prioritized monetary policy over employment. A chain reaction led from bank crashes to going off the gold standard to competitive currency devaluations. Yet here we are nearly 100 years out from the crash and almost 20 years out from the financial crisis. We're still scapegoating working people for tariffs. And for the past 30 years, people have argued that criticizing competitive currency devaluations is protectionist, but actually devaluing your currency to gain a competitive advantage isn't. We've been so convinced that the masses were responsible for the problems of the 1930s that our reaction to popular demand for more equitable trade policy is to dismiss the plaints of working people as economic ignorance. Even today, there's a view that trade has to be the province of technocrats who can calculate theoretically perfect outcomes that may or may not be related to the actual lived experience of working people, of our fellow voters. Now, that's not to say that the economists who debunked Smoot-Hawley think it was a great idea. They don't across the political spectrum, but they do want to get the history right, and I appreciate that. So President Franklin Roosevelt comes to office in the spring of 1933. On tariffs, he did feel that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were too high, but that didn't mean he thought the tariffs needed to go to zero. I think there's a really interesting question about what Adam Smith meant by free trade, what others have meant free trade. Does it mean trade to facilitate competition or setting tariffs at zero? From what I've seen, Cordell Hull wanted the tariffs to permit competition, but not necessarily go to zero. So there it is again, the relationship between tariffs and the effects on competition. As Roosevelt was looking to reduce the tariffs, he was also pursuing a host of other policies designed to produce a more equitable economy. Why? Because he felt that economic insecurity for working people contributed to the fall of the Weimar Republic in Germany and risked fascism or communism, totalitarianism in whatever form, here in the United States. Economic precarity undermines democracy. Economic security promotes it. So the New Deal delivered rules protecting organized labor, social security, financial market regulation, antitrust rules and enforcement, trust busting. When it came time to think about what post-war economic governance would look like, FDR's goal was to internationalize the New Deal. In the Atlantic Charter from 1941, he and Winston Churchill contended that the purpose of economic collaboration was to promote labor standards, economic advancement, and social security, not to achieve free trade. The Atlantic Charter formed the basis for the ITO Charter, also known as the Havana Charter because it was signed in pre-Castro Cuba in 1948. The ITO Charter was meant to be the third prong of the Bretton Woods institutions. It included enforceable labor standards, as Ambassador Tai mentioned, and the anti-monopoly rules, which she also mentioned. In this case, FDR's concern wasn't just the domestic trusts, but it was also monopolistic behavior by foreign governments like the Third Reich. And it was Churchill who warned during the war that the Soviet model of state trading and slave labor would come to threaten what we today would call market-oriented democracies, especially those in Europe. The ITO Charter died in Congress. Here again, we're recipients of very select information. When I studied trade in college and law school, I was told the ITO was an organization killed by an isolationist Congress, which didn't like international institutions. Sure, that's partly true. Republicans took control of Congress during Truman's term, and the isolationist wing of the party, in fact, did not like international institutions. But I wasn't ever taught anything about the substance of the ITO Charter, the rules in the ITO Charter. And I was in law school studying international trade law when the Uruguay round was being negotiated and then voted on in Congress. It never made any sense to me the ITO was killed because Congress doesn't like international institutions, but we had the GATT, which was an international institution. When you look at the actual substance of the ITO Charter, it makes much more sense. One of the most famous Republican isolationists of the era was Robert Taft. What else was Taft known for? Taft-Hartley, which unwound some of those hard-won New Deal labor protections and is on the books to this day. Taft believed in equalizing conditions at home and abroad, but you can do that by lifting labor standards over there or lowering them over here. Roosevelt was in favor of the former, Taft was in favor of the latter. Guess who else opposed the ITO Charter? The National Association of Manufacturers. It's not hard to see how we ended up with trickle-down globalization, facilitating labor and environmental arbitrage all over the world. Ted, you mentioned the race to the bottom. That's what it is. It's arbitrage and downward pressure. Should we be thinking about the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh in 2013, a textile factory, as this era's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? What strikes me about the way we've been taught the history of this period is the way the narrative memory holds the fact that there was a very real economic power struggle between working people and robber barons. The battle for the Republican nomination in 1952 was between Taft and Eisenhower. Eisenhower won. Eisenhower supported an excess profits tax during the Korean War. He thought oligopolists could price gouge and cause inflation. He gave a speech at the AFL in New York. Ted, as you've noted, Ambassador Tai has drawn on history to help us think about how we can move forward with a version of globalization that's better for working people all over the world. She had an op-ed in the Financial Times in May that reflected this approach. Who spearheaded the letter to the Financial Times criticizing her position? The National Association of Manufacturers. So we have continuity across 100 years. What does all of this mean going forward? History shows us that tariffs can indeed be used to prop up monopolies and extract rents from working people. History also shows us that domestic anti-monopoly efforts and labor rights protections contribute to a more equal society and a more stable democracy. And history shows us that monopolies aren't limited to private actors, but that countries can adopt monopolistic, anti-competitive approaches to trade. History shows us that laissez-faire globalization leads to that race to the bottom. Put that all together, and we see that there is, therefore, space to think about tariffs as a way of protecting competition itself. With the right domestic laws in place, protecting workers and reining in concentrations of economic power, tariffs don't have to facilitate rent sinking by monopolists. They can contribute to tackling the anti-competitive practices of others, reversing that race to the bottom, and growing our middle classes. So thank you, Ted, for all your work on memory. I'm excited to see where your research continues to take you. History doesn't repeat itself, but I am one of those people who thinks it can help us understand contemporary challenges. If we get the history wrong, we increase our chances of getting the policy wrong, too.
Well, thank you very much, Ted and Beth. Let me remind viewers, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab. I have one or two of my own just to get things started. And these are for both of you, but perhaps a little bit more for you, Ted. You spoke about the memory of Smoot-Hawley being used not just against tariffs, but also to justify free trade policy, sort of in a more sort of offensive way, I guess you could say, and under President Clinton, Reagan or President Clinton. You also talked about the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 under FDR. And it just interests me when I think about the comparison between Smoot-Hawley of 1930, RTA of 1934. Why do you think the negative memory, if I can sort of cast it in a kind of broad light, the negative memory of Smoot-Hawley protectionism under Hoover has been so much stronger than, again, in a sort of broad fashion, the positive, or at least the offensive memory of the liberalizing impact of the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act under Roosevelt?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you didn't need to resuscitate the memory of the RTA because that's still how things were being negotiated. I mean, you have this big debate in 1991 about extending MFN status to China, and this is after Tiananmen, and so there's this sort of civil rights outcry around it, and you have some people saying, oh, if we restrict this, it'll go back to Smoot-Hawley. I mean, they mean this in sort of a literal sense, which is like Smoot-Hawley is like on the books, right? And if you took away MFN status, it would do that. But at the same time, other people point out that no, we've now extended this most favored nation. I think most people know this, but to over 100 countries, and so like doing this for just one country doesn't really matter. And so I think you're right that now Smoot-Hawley is still much more dominant. You actually see in the 60s, in the sort of Cordell Hull mythologization period, saying how great it was that he eventually did this, and ever since then we've moved away from the policy of protectionism and isolationism. Actually, I think. But you're right that it's faded today. I have a Kennedy quote here, actually, because he explicitly mentions this. Kennedy says that in 1934, under the leadership of Cordell Hull, the United States started on the long road back from both protectionism and isolationism. This was an expression of America's leadership of the free world and a symbol of freedom and growing together. But I think you're right that after that, and maybe it has to do with the era of really like the WTO emerging, that's no longer seen as the most important kind of trade tool. But you do have a lot of references to that more in the 60s, and so yeah.
Okay. Beth, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. Something that has been a real challenge for us is the memory that somehow Roosevelt was all about tariff cuts and a diehard free trader, that has led people to feel comfortable as progressives with the view that we just need to get rid of all of our tariffs, when in fact what FDR wanted was to internationalize the New Deal. So I think we've been left with, I'm a Democrat, so I'll speak for what I've seen in the Democratic Party, that you've got people who reject trickle-down economics here at home, but are actually totally fine with trickle-down economics in our international economic policy. And that is a conflict I don't think people are even aware they have, or that it's very hard to have the kind of economy progressives want here at home if you've exposed your workers to the kind of labor arbitrage that we've been talking about.
So the proper way to remember the RTAA is in context with Roosevelt's domestic policies. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. Beth, just listening to what you said about the Havana Charter and the ITO, and it, never really made it past the blueprint stage because of the opposition you described, not just from Senator Taft, but also, as you said, from the business community. And you also distinguish between the content of the ITO versus the issue of kind of sacrificing sovereignty to become a member of international organizations. I wanted to not push back, but I wanted to just ask you to elaborate on that, because that was the second time the United States decided not to join an international institution, which it had a leading role in proposing. Of course, the first time that was the second time in about 30 years, the first time, of course, being the League of Nations. And while it's true that the U.S. did join the GATT and then later the WTO, which was even more binding, we've seen under both, frankly, probably starting in the late Obama administration, but certainly under both during the first Trump administration and during the Biden administration, we've seen a kind of bipartisan unhappiness with the WTO, on dispute settlement, maybe on national security, which seems to me at least to reflect, yes, perhaps some content issues, but how can you really differentiate between what's a content issue and what's a kind of sacrificing sovereignty issue? And so I just wonder if you're right, then one could be optimistic that in some future time, for example, let's think about a climate club that had real teeth, which was advancing both climate objectives and some kind of general economic fairness goals. If you're right, then that one could be optimistic that the United States would be willing to join that kind of organization. But I'm wondering if the sovereignty issue is still not in the background, at least.
Thank you for that question. So I have a lot of respect, obviously, for the people who gave us the post-war peace. And that's part of the reason I spent so much time going over what's in the ITO Charter. And I've read their memoirs. When you read, and Cordell Hull was out of it by the time they were negotiating the ITO Charter. If you take a look at the way dispute settlement, it wasn't called dispute settlement, it's settlement of differences, which is much more polite. If you look at the way they handled it under that agreement, they had mechanisms for resolving their differences. If you didn't like the outcome, there was an expedited process for you to leave the organization. That's how they viewed sovereignty. I think they would be very shocked to think that at any point in time, an independent government's sovereignty was on the table, or that national sovereignty would actually be subsumed in the way that I think a lot of people think about it today. They tried to create that wriggle room, and that was also similar to how the GATT was. So I think they understood the limits of what governments would give away in terms of their sovereignty. In their memoirs, they say domestic economic requirements for our people are always going to take precedence. I think if someone like that said said something similar in the last 10 years, they'd be ridiculed as a Luddite or, detached or not sufficiently attuned to international diplomacy. So that's another way in which things have changed over generations that has, I think, led us to misunderstand what the original goal was. So I think there's nothing wrong with signing up for agreements. I used to litigate WTO cases where the United States across multiple administrations has been concerned is when the appellate body or a panel substitutes its judgment and doesn't interpret the commitments that we made. It's a contract. And if the governing, the interpretive body isn't respecting the contract, then you're going to have a problem.
Thanks. So it's more the nature of the contract when you share sovereignty rather than the abstract principle of it. Is that a right way of summarizing?
And I think maybe forgetting that we used to actually, in the 40s, they thought sovereignty was important. Even the people who were signing up to these agreements thought that sovereignty was something that needed to be respected.
Okay, thanks.
Peter, just quickly.
Ted, please. Yeah.
On the, you were referring to the League of Nations, I think, right? And I think Adam Tooze in the book The Deluge has a really good bit on this, that this wasn't the GOP being isolationist by rejecting it. They wanted to restrict, they wanted to avoid any kind of curtailment of their sovereignty. So the GOP was internationalist and continued to be after World War II, but they wanted internationalism on a very specific set of terms. And I think that that is very important in terms of this kind of memory aspect, that it was the details of internationalism, not internationalism per se, that was being debated.
Thanks. Let me convey a question we've got from one of our viewers. Just putting it simply, aren't memory battles also fought about whose history is being represented and not just how it is being remembered today? What do you think about that idea, the who as opposed to the sort of how?
I definitely agree with that, and that's something that I really look at. It was on this final slide, but I can just read it instead of pull it back up. But what I talk about is that when memory is sort of unique in the economic realm, is that rather than flattening class divisions, which is the case of the memory of wars and violent traumas, you'd say this injury was done, say 9/11 was an attack on all Americans, right? It sort of flattens class distinctions. Whereas when you get a kind of dominant economic memory, it really elevates one class or economic group above all others. Think in the German case, if the hyperinflation was a trauma for all of Germany, well, it was actually a trauma for savers. It was actually really good for debtors, right? But you're saying this was an injury to all Germans. What you're doing is elevating then the savers above everyone else and making them more central. Same with Reagan saying something like, to be American is to be a free trader. You're saying that the people that benefit from free trade are the real Americans. And so, and in doing so, you obviously discard the people who might have been hurt from it. So it absolutely is about, whose memory matters.
And one thing I've noticed as people talk about Smoot-Hawley, it's a proxy for dangerous populism. And that's why I think it's so interesting who is asking for the tariffs. And that goes to who's writing the history and who's telling the story and who benefits from a particular narrative that's being advanced. Because Smoot-Hawley really was about industrialists getting protections for themselves, as opposed to masses of workers demanding tariff protection.
Well, on the who issue, we have another question which frames it in this way: considering the massive impact Brexit has had on trade, which and this viewer sees it essentially as rejection of free trade, isn't it a bit of a mischaracterization that tariffs can work when paired with other policies, because aren't the most likely persons receiving the pain of tariffs the so-called working people, as prices go up immediately, while jobs might take a while to materialize? And shouldn't the suggestion be that certain policies can be supported by specific narrow tariffs to enable specific industries to grow rather than advocating sort of large across the board tariffs.
I guess I would take issue with the idea that Brexit was a rejection of free trade. When you look at the narratives around that, it's often sold in as much a sort of hyper liberal free trade narrative as it is. It's not really saying we're rejecting trade with the EU. It's saying the EU's sort of too parochial, and we want to call back to this imperial past. I mean, you have Theresa May saying, Britain will get back to its roots as a great trading nation, and so global Britain, right? And so, while the actual economic effect was probably to limit trade overall, the narrative supporting that really wasn't. And I think that's it's not part of this exact research, but that's another kind of specific memory looking back, right? The way the British Empire, the way that works in the kind of British societal memory and how that's mobilized for foreign economic policy.
If I could jump in on that too. I also think there's work to be done on when tariffs pass through to consumers. I think there's just an assumption that we live in a world of perfect competition, therefore tariffs always pass straight through. I think it's much more complicated than that. More broadly, I think the question is, and I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting it, but are tariffs the only tool in the toolkit? No. And I think for President Biden, when you look at his economic agenda, what has he tried to do? Invest in America, whether it's the Infrastructure Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. Invest in America, also investing in workers, most pro-labor president, at least since Roosevelt, I think. And then the third prong is competition policy. So I think what you see from the Biden administration is a recognition that we did experience laissez-faire globalization for decades. It resulted in the hollowing out of parts of our industrial base. We need to find a way to repair that for all sorts of reasons: economic security for working people, economic security more broadly. So you're going to have an array of tools in your toolkits. Tariffs are one of them. We know we created a global trading system that tolerates anti-competitive practices, and we're going to have to find a way to correct for that, and that's what we've been trying to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Beth. Thanks to the viewers for your question. It's probably fair to say we're in some kind of transitional phase in terms of our economic historical memories, and I suppose the incoming administration, particularly if it does pursue strong tariff policies, will have an impact not only in the real economy but also on how we think about and remember previous historical periods. So there'll be a lot to continue to look at. We'll certainly do our part and hope to continue to have opportunities with you, Ted and Beth, to do that. So everyone, whether you are on whatever side of the Atlantic you're on, let me say have the good rest of your day and look forward to having you join us at future events of the American German Institute. So long.
Great. Thanks so much.